On his 68th birthday, Robert opened his safe and found nothing, $180,000 gone. His late wife's jewelry vanished and the lock untouched. No break-in, no forced entry, just a hollow space where his life's work used to be. The betrayal burned deeper than theft. It came from inside his own home. As he stared at the empty safe, his hands trembled not from age but rage. Someone he loved had turned into a stranger. And soon they'd learn what it meant to steal from a man who built everything himself. Subscribe for part 2 and comment what you'd do in his place. The flashing red and blue lights painted the front of Robert's house in cold streaks of color. 2 officers stood in the living room, notebooks in hand, asking polite but tired questions. Robert sat on the edge of his armchair, his fingers laced so tightly his knuckles whitened. Across from him, Daniel leaned casually against the doorway, arms crossed, wearing that calm expression he always used when he thought charm could fix anything. Beside him, Clara sipped tea, pretending the entire thing was a misunderstanding. The performance was too smooth, too practiced. The officer asked again, "So, Mr. Miller, there's no sign of forced entry?" Robert shook his head slowly. No broken locks, no windows open, nothing missing except what was in the safe. He could still see the gaping hole in the wall behind his bookshelf, the metal door of the safe swinging loose, its contents gone. $180,000. His late wife's wedding ring. 20 years of careful saving vanished in one night. Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm, too calm. "Dad, you probably forgot to lock it. Maybe it's misplaced. You've been under a lot of stress since Mom passed." That tone, half concern, half condescension, stabbed deeper than any insult. Clara added softly, "Maybe the cleaning lady? You said she was here last week, right?" Her eyes flicked toward Daniel before settling on Robert with a rehearsed sadness. Robert's stomach tightened. He had known them both since Clara was a nervous college girl trying to impress him at Sunday dinners. Now she stood there perfectly composed, suggesting strangers had stolen what she knew wasn't theirs. Daniel's phone buzzed, and without shame he answered it right there, laughing at something before stepping outside for a quick call. The detective jotted down a few notes, asked for a list of missing items, and promised to follow up. Robert nodded, but his mind wasn't on the conversation. His eyes followed Daniel through the window, watching his son pace the porch like a man waiting for a deal to close. When the officers left, the house fell quiet. The air was heavy, thick with something that felt like the aftermath of a storm. Daniel came back in, whistling low, pretending nothing had happened. "We'll help you, Dad," he said. "We'll check with the neighbors, maybe see if anyone's got cameras." Robert just nodded. He didn't trust his voice to hold steady. That night he couldn't sleep. The house, once filled with laughter and Sunday dinners, now felt foreign. From his bedroom upstairs he could hear them talking in the kitchen. Clara's whisper. Sharp Daniel's tone, low but firm. He caught fragments of sentences. "He won't notice. Too old to. And just until things settle." Each word was a knife twisting deeper into a wound he hadn't realized was still open. Robert sat up, the dark room spinning slightly. His wife's photo sat on the nightstand, her soft smile frozen in time. "Helen," he whispered, "our boy's not who we thought he was." The next morning, Daniel and Clara were already at the table when he came down. Clara poured him coffee with a smile so polished it hurt to look at. "Rough night, Dad?" she asked sweetly. Daniel chuckled. "Maybe you should get some rest. The cops will handle it." Robert stared at them, studying every movement. The way Daniel avoided eye contact. The faint tremor in Clara's hands when she lifted her cup. The smell of expensive perfume, Clara's favorite, mixing with the faint scent of guilt. Later that day, while they went to the store, Robert stood in front of the safe again. He touched the cold steel, tracing the scratches near the keypad. His wife's engagement ring had been inside. He remembered her slipping it off only once to place it carefully in that box, saying, "It'll stay safe here." The memory burned through him like acid. When Daniel and Clara returned, they were carrying shopping bags. New clothes, fresh takeout, and something else, a faint scent of new leather. Robert noticed a tag on Daniel's jacket still hanging from the sleeve. Did you get a raise I didn't hear about? Robert asked quietly. Daniel laughed. Just needed a few things. You worry too much. That night, Robert checked the garage. Daniel's car, once a beat-up Ford, had new rims. A polished stereo system glowed blue under the dash. Robert touched the cold metal hood and felt anger rise again. The following morning, Clara left her laptop open on the kitchen counter. A notification popped up, a confirmation email from a luxury realtor downtown. Robert froze. The subject line read, "Purchase agreement. Pending transfer." His chest tightened, breath short. He scrolled further and saw the details. A new house. A down payment suspiciously close to under $80,000. He closed the laptop quietly and stared out the window. The garden Helen used to love was dying, overrun with weeds. He realized it wasn't just money they'd stolen. It was legacy trust, everything he and his wife had built. That evening, Daniel came home whistling again, a box of takeout in one hand and a new watch flashing on his wrist. He grinned. "You should eat, Dad. You look like hell." Robert looked at him. Really looked. The boy he'd raised was gone, replaced by a stranger in designer shoes. "Where did you get the money, Daniel?" he asked. The smile faded just enough to show the truth behind it. "Don't start," Daniel muttered. "You always think the worst." Robert said nothing more. He just nodded the calm before something far worse than anger. That night he lay awake, eyes open in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of betrayal breathing under his own roof. When dawn broke, he made coffee and sat by the window watching Daniel load his car. He saw the new leather seats, the shine of arrogance in every move. Clara came out behind him, kissing his cheek like they were the picture of success. As the car pulled away, Robert whispered to himself, "You think you've won." His voice was low, steady, dangerous. "You've just started a war you can't even see." He opened his notebook and began writing dates, times, every purchase, every lie. His hand didn't shake. The fear had turned into something else now, something sharper. Because once a father's heart breaks, what's left is not weakness, it's clarity. And clarity in the right hands can be the most dangerous weapon of all. He stared at the last line he'd written. "They think I'm finished." Then slowly, a faint smile curved across his lips. They had no idea what was coming next. The detective returned 2 days later, his expression the same kind of blank Robert remembered from his years in finance, the look of a man who's seen too many disappointments to show much left. Rain streaked the window panes as he stepped inside, wiping his shoes on the mat. Robert stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, staring into the flames that burned low and steady. Daniel and Clara sat on the couch, their faces arranged in masks of concern. Mr. Miller, the detective, began, voice polite but distant. "We've completed our review. There's no sign of forced entry anywhere on the property. No broken windows, no tampered locks. Whoever did this used the code." Robert's eyes lifted from the fire. "So what you're saying," he said slowly, "is that it was someone inside this house." The detective hesitated. Only 3 people had access to that code. You, your son, your daughter-in-law. His gaze flicked to Daniel, then Clara, then back to Robert. "If you'd like, we can proceed with a formal statement and—" "That won't be necessary." Robert interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut through the quiet. "You've done what you can." Clara leaned forward, her voice soft, trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "Detective, surely you don't think—" He raised a hand. "Ma'am, I'm not accusing anyone. I'm just telling you the facts. If anything else turns up, we'll contact you." The door closed behind him, leaving the 3 of them in silence. The sound of the rain filled the space like static. Robert turned from the fire, the light flickering across his face. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for a reaction, waiting to see if he'd break. Daniel was the first to speak. "Dad, don't take it like that. He's just doing his job." Robert studied him for a long time. The boy he'd once carried on his shoulders now stood across from him, grown confident, lying through perfect teeth. The denial came easy to Daniel. It always had. "Funny thing about codes," Robert said at last. "They tell you who can open the door, but they also tell you who can't." Clara's fingers tightened around her cup. "Robert, you can't possibly believe we had anything to do with this." He smiled faintly. "Can't I?" Her face paled. Daniel stepped in, his voice hardening. "That's enough. You've been under stress. You're seeing shadows where there aren't any." Robert turned away before he said something he couldn't take back. He walked to the window, staring out into the storm. Lightning flashed, illuminating the garden Helen had once tended. Her roses, now wilted, bent low under the weight of the rain. He remembered her hands, steady and sure, planting each one with the same care she'd used to raise their son. And now that son was sitting behind him, watching him like a predator watches the injured. He spoke without turning around. The detective said something interesting. He said whoever did it knew the layout, knew where the cameras didn't reach. He faced them again, eyes sharp. "You two were the only ones who asked about that." Daniel laughed, a hollow sound, brittle and forced. "You're paranoid. Maybe it's time you talk to someone. This isn't healthy." Robert took a step closer. "I already did." "The police." The silence that followed was dense, suffocating. Clara looked at the floor, Daniel looked at the door, and Robert looked at them both as if seeing them for the first time. He could almost hear Helen's voice in the back of his mind. "Trust is earned once and lost forever." That night he sat at the kitchen table long after they'd gone to bed. The rain had stopped, but the clock on the wall ticked too loudly. On the table lay the detective's card, a scrap of paper with a name and a phone number. He turned it over, then tucked it into his wallet. He'd need it later. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, the good kind Helen used to buy for anniversaries. The liquid caught the dim light like amber fire. He sipped, letting the burn travel down his throat, steadying him. His reflection in the dark window looked older, harder. A man who had finally stopped making excuses. From upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Clara's laugh, soft, nervous, floated down the hall. Then Daniel's voice, low, irritated. A muffled argument. Robert couldn't make out the words, but the tone told him enough. They were cracking under the weight of their own greed. He took another sip and opened his notebook again. He'd written down the safe's code months ago, 6 digits that meant everything: Helen's birthday, their anniversary. Daniel had helped him set it once after the stroke made it hard for Robert to remember long numbers. That was when he'd shared the code. Out of trust. Out of love. And now out of that same love they had gutted him clean. He flipped to a fresh page and wrote a single sentence: "They used what I gave them." The ink bled slightly into the paper, the way grief seeps into the soul. He set the pen down and stared at the words until they blurred. By morning he'd made a decision. He went to the local bank, checked every account, every transfer. Nothing unusual. But when he asked to see his safe deposit box, something caught his eye: a new access signature. Dated the same day his home safe was emptied. The signature read, D. Miller, his son's handwriting. He felt a rush of cold that no coat could fix. The heart refused to accept it, even as the logic carved it in stone. Back home, he cooked breakfast as usual. The smell of eggs and bacon filled the kitchen, warm and familiar. Daniel came down, hair messy, pretending exhaustion. Clara followed, dressed too nicely for a quiet morning at home. Robert set a plate in front of his son, his movements calm, precise. "You went to the bank?" he said, his voice even. Daniel froze for a split second, then laughed. "You must be mistaken." "Am I?" Clara's fork clinked against her plate. Her eyes darted to Daniel, then to Robert, then away. The air felt electric, charged with the weight of everything unspoken. Robert smiled faintly, but his eyes didn't match the expression. "The detective will want to know that." He stood, pushing his chair back slowly. "Eat up. You'll need the energy." He left them sitting there in silence, their breakfast untouched. Upstairs, he closed his office door and locked it. He picked up the phone, dialing the number on the detective's card. His voice was steady when he spoke. "It's Robert Miller. I think I found something you should see." The detective's tone shifted instantly. "You're sure?" "Absolutely." He hung up and leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time since this began, the fear was gone. In its place was something colder, cleaner. Resolve. Downstairs, he could hear Daniel's voice rising sharp with panic. Clara whispering urgently. The house felt alive with tension, like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. Robert glanced at the photo on his desk, Helen smiling in the garden sunlight in her hair. "You were right," he murmured. "They showed me who they are." He looked toward the window where the morning light cut across the floor like a blade. The war had already begun. They just didn't know it yet. Robert didn't sleep much after that call. The detective had come and gone again. The questions had been asked, the answers given, and yet the silence that followed was louder than ever. In the daylight, the house looked ordinary, but something inside it had changed, like a stage where the actors kept smiling even after the play was over. Daniel and Clara moved through the rooms with forced calm, whispering behind closed doors, acting as if nothing had happened. But Robert saw it all. Every hesitation, every sudden glance, every nervous pause. They thought he was too old to notice. They were wrong. He'd spent 40 years tracking numbers, clients' portfolios, and markets that could turn on a single decimal. He understood patterns better than most men understood people. So when he began to rebuild the timeline of his own robbery, he did it like a professional, without emotion, without mercy. He took out his old yellow legal pad, the one he hadn't used since retirement, and began to write. He started with the last normal day he remembered. The day before the robbery, Daniel had offered to help with the yard work. Robert had found it strange. His son hadn't touched a rake in 10 years. Clara had volunteered to clean the study afterward. That was when the safe would have been accessible. He circled the date in red ink. Then he began connecting dots. Receipts, gas station stops, credit card charges. His son's new Audi had been registered the same day the money disappeared. Clara's bank statement showed an electronic transfer to a real estate agent 3 days later. Robert had access to the bank portal. His name was still listed as co-signer on their old joint emergency account. They'd forgotten to remove him. He almost laughed. Each discovery stoked the fire inside him. Betrayal had replaced grief, and from its ashes rose a different kind of clarity. He no longer saw Daniel as his son. He saw him as a thief with his last name. The affection that once blinded him had burned away, leaving something cold and sharp in its place. He didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, he watched. He listened. The more they believed he was retreating into silence, the more careless they became. He noticed how Clara started taking afternoon drives alone, how Daniel spent hours on the phone in the garage, talking in hushed tones. He recorded their license plate movements on a small notepad, marking timestamps like a detective. He also made a trip downtown to an old friend, Calvin Marks, a private investigator who'd helped a few of Robert's clients over the years. Calvin was retired too, but boredom had made him restless. Over a cup of black coffee at a diner on Jefferson Street, Robert laid it all out: the missing money, the code, the signatures, the new car. Calvin listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting something down. "Family cases," Calvin said finally, "are always the dirtiest. You sure you want to see what's under the rug?" Robert met his eyes. "I've lived long enough to stop fearing the truth." Calvin nodded slowly. "Then I'll dig." The next 2 weeks were a blur of quiet routines and hidden strategies. Robert played the role of the grieving old man perfectly. He made breakfast, read the paper, watered the plants, and smiled when Clara asked about his day. But behind the calm, his mind was moving like clockwork. He installed a new security camera inside the study, disguised in a framed photo of Helen. He began forwarding all house phone calls to his cell so he could record any odd messages while he was out. And every night after Daniel and Clara went to bed, he went into the office to review Calvin's updates. The reports arrived in plain brown envelopes. Inside were photos: Daniel meeting with a man in a parking lot near Glendale, cash changing hands. Clara visiting a jewelry shop selling pieces that matched Helen's stolen collection. One receipt time-stamped just 2 days after the break-in made Robert's chest tighten. $14K gold pendant appraisal, $12,800. He'd given that pendant to Helen on their 30th anniversary. Robert sat in his dark office, the only light coming from the desk lamp. He picked up the photo and studied Clara's face. No guilt, no hesitation, just greed. His jaw tightened. The bourbon glass beside him trembled as he set it down. He called Calvin the next morning. "I have what I need," he said simply. Calvin exhaled. "What's your plan?" Robert looked through the window, watching Daniel load his golf clubs into the new Audi. "To let them dig their own graves," he replied. And they did. The next few days, Robert began testing them, pushing small boundaries to measure their reactions. He mentioned the police had found new evidence. Daniel's smile faltered for half a second. He told Clara he was thinking about updating the will. Her coffee cup nearly slipped from her hand. Each reaction was confirmation, each flicker of fear a silent confession. He also began preparing his counterstrike. He contacted the bank's fraud division, reporting unauthorized access to his safe deposit box. Then he moved all remaining assets into a new trust one Daniel couldn't touch. Quietly, methodically, he erased their access to his accounts, his insurance, his pension. Within a week, their safety net was gone, and they didn't even know it. At dinner, they laughed and toasted as if nothing was wrong. Daniel poured wine. Clara bragged about a new house they were considering. Robert smiled, nodding along. "Sounds like you two have been busy," he said, voice calm and measured. Daniel grinned. "You'll see it soon, Dad. We're finally getting somewhere." "I'm sure you are," Robert said. "Just make sure it's somewhere safe." The remark hung in the air for a beat too long. Clara's smile thinned. Daniel looked at him like he was trying to read between the words. But Robert gave them nothing. No expression, no hint of anger, just silence. That night he opened his ledger again, marking the date and time of the final entry. "They're running out of rope." The following morning, a thick envelope arrived by courier Calvin's last delivery. Inside was a full report complete with photos, bank records, and notarized statements. At the bottom was a note scrawled in Calvin's rough handwriting, "All trails lead back to them. Be careful how you use this." Robert stared at the evidence spread across the table. Every piece fit perfectly. Every lie was mapped. He'd spent his entire career advising others how to protect their fortunes. Now he would use that same expertise to dismantle his son's illusion of power, one calculated step at a time. He gathered the papers, sealed them in a folder, and placed it inside his desk drawer. As he closed it, he caught a glimpse of Helen's photo again. Her smile seemed softer now, almost approving. The house was quiet that evening. Too quiet. Daniel was out, Clara upstairs. Robert poured himself another drink and leaned back in his chair, listening to the ticking of the old clock. Every second sounded deliberate, heavy, final. He'd spent a lifetime teaching people that wealth wasn't about money, it was about control. And now he was ready to prove it. The first domino was about to fall. 3 days after the theft, Robert heard the sound. Before he saw it, the low, polished hum of an engine that didn't belong to anyone struggling with bills. The noise grew louder, steady, confident, until the gleam of a brand-new silver Audi rolled into his driveway like a slap across the face. The morning sun caught on its mirror-finish hood, throwing a blinding flash into the window where Robert stood with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He just stared as Daniel stepped out, grinning like a man who'd just won the lottery. The car door clicked shut with the smooth, expensive sound of arrogance. Daniel ran a hand across the roof as if he were caressing a prize. "Beautiful, isn't she?" he called toward the window. Clara followed behind, holding 2 takeout coffees and a shopping bag that glinted with a high-end logo. Her smile was the kind of smile people wear when they know something you don't or think you don't. Robert opened the front door slowly. The hinges groaned. The air felt thick. "New car?" he asked, his tone mild, perfectly measured. Daniel's grin widened. "Yeah, got a great deal." Dealer practically gave it away. You know how it is. Robert nodded, setting his cup down on the porch railing. Paid cash, did you? Daniel chuckled, glancing at Clara like they shared a private joke. Something like that, something like that. The words sat heavy in Robert's chest. He felt the pulse in his jaw but kept his expression neutral. Years of dealing with panicked investors had taught him the art of control. Rage when caged properly was more powerful than any outburst. Clara walked closer, her heels clicking on the gravel. You should take it for a drive, Robert. Daniel says it handles like a dream. Robert looked at the car again, the way the sunlight danced on the chrome, the faint smell of new leather drifting through the open window. He imagined his wife's hands tracing that same dashboard once had she been alive to see this. Helen would have recognized the insult for what it was, a trophy built from betrayal. He smiled faintly. Maybe later, he said. I'm more of a Ford man. They laughed, thinking they'd won something. Then Daniel tossed him the keys. Go on. You deserve it, Dad. After everything that's happened, a little joy wouldn't hurt. Robert caught the keys, felt the weight of them in his palm. The Audi emblem glinted in the sun, sharp and cruel. He looked down at it for a long moment before handing them back. Keep your joy, son. You'll need it. Daniel frowned, the first crack in his performance. What's that supposed to mean? Robert's tone stayed even. Nothing at all. Just drive safe. That night Robert didn't sleep. He sat at his desk, the blinds half closed, the faint glow of a desk lamp outlining the stack of papers Calvin had sent. The photographs lay in front of him. Daniel at the dealership, a handshake, a signature. The car payment was traced to a cashier's check, anonymous, untraceable, but the timing was perfect. Too perfect. He flipped to the next page. Clara inside a jewelry store, her hand stretched across the counter. The pendant gleamed under the display lights. Helen's pendant. Robert's breath came slow, deliberate. The bourbon beside him remained untouched. His anger wasn't a storm. Now it was a quiet sea before the tide pulls back and reveals what's been buried underneath. He didn't want to scream. He wanted precision. The next morning he stood by the window again. Daniel was out washing the Audi, whistling. The hose water ran down the driveway, pooling near the gutter, carrying with it small flecks of soap, and the faint reflection of a man who had no idea his world was collapsing inch by inch. Clara stood by him, laughing about something trivial. She wore a gold bracelet Robert didn't recognize, new, undoubtedly bought with money that wasn't theirs. Robert turned from the window and went to the phone. He called Calvin. I need you to find out where the car's registered, he said, and who the financing company is if there is one. Calvin didn't ask questions. Give me a few hours. Robert spent those hours in silence, pruning the garden Helen had planted years ago. The roses had overgrown, but the roots were strong. As he cut the stems, he thought of how easily beauty could hide thorns sharp enough to draw blood. By evening, Calvin called back. It's under Daniel's name. Cash purchase. Full payment. No loan. Robert closed his eyes. Amount $82,000, give or take fees. The number hung between them. It was less than half of what had been taken, but enough to make the pattern clear. Send me the paperwork, Robert said. When he hung up, he looked out the window again. Daniel was backing the car out, the headlights cutting through the dusk. The taillights glowed red, twin scars disappearing into the distance. Clara waved from the doorway before locking it behind her. Robert watched her silhouette pass through the kitchen, humming. He walked to the study, pulled open the safe, now empty, stripped bare, and stared at the hollow darkness inside. The echo of metal against metal filled the room. It wasn't the emptiness that hurt him anymore. It was what it revealed. They hadn't just stolen his money. They'd stolen the illusion that family meant loyalty. He reached for Helen's framed photo on the shelf. Her smile, soft and steady, looked back at him through the glass. You warned me, he whispered. You saw what I refused to see. The next day, Daniel called from the driveway. Dad, you should come out. Let me show you the engine. Robert walked out slowly. The car was spotless, the hood propped open like a silver altar to vanity. Daniel was explaining horsepower, torque, efficiency words he didn't even understand. Clara stood beside him, nodding, playing her part. Robert leaned forward, resting his hand on the edge of the hood. The metal was still warm from the drive. He looked at Daniel and smiled faintly. "You must be proud." Daniel laughed. "You bet I am." "Good," Robert said quietly. "Just make sure you enjoy it while it lasts." Daniel's grin faltered. "What's that supposed to mean?" Robert straightened. "Everything built on lies falls apart eventually. Ask the markets. Ask time. Ask anyone who's ever thought they could cheat both." Clara shifted uncomfortably. "Robert, are you feeling all right?" "I've never been clearer," he said. He turned and went back inside, leaving them standing in the sun, confused, uneasy. In his study, he picked up the phone again and dialed a different number, the contact on a form Calvin had included in the last report. A man named Jensen, Property Records Specialist. "I want to know everything about that house my son's buying," he said. "Every document, every lien, every unpaid tax." Jensen hesitated. "Planning to buy it?" Robert's tone was calm, deliberate. "Planning to own it." When he hung up, he glanced once more through the blinds. Daniel was still outside polishing the Audi under the fading light, proud and oblivious. Robert watched him for a long time, then whispered to the empty room, "Enjoy the driveway, son. Soon it won't be yours to stand on." Robert had learned long ago that silence was a weapon sharper than any blade. The trick was knowing when to draw it. That morning, while Daniel and Clara were out parading their new Audi through the neighborhood like royalty, he sat in his study, the blinds half closed, the air thick with a calm that didn't belong to forgiveness. The evidence lay spread before him in tidy piles, receipts, photos, bank statements, all carefully labeled. He had enough to confront them, enough to destroy the illusion they'd built around their lies. But confrontation was for amateurs. Robert had no interest in shouting matches or broken dishes. He wanted something cleaner, colder. He wanted them to feel the kind of loss that didn't heal. He dialed a number written in Calvin's neat, deliberate hand. The man who answered had the crisp tone of someone who lived in spreadsheets. "Harris & Cole Forensic Accounting," the voice said. "This is Robert Miller," he replied. "I'd like to hire you to trace a theft. It's personal." There was a pause. Then the man said, "How much money are we talking about?" $180,000, Robert said flatly. "And a few things that can't be measured." By the time Daniel returned home that evening, Robert had already set the trap in motion. He greeted his son with the same mild warmth as always, even offered him a drink. Daniel relaxed, thinking the old man was softening. Over dinner, they talked about football, the rising cost of gas, the weather, everything but the war quietly being waged between them. That night, when the house finally went still, Robert turned on the desk lamp again. The investigator's email glowed on the screen. "We'll begin with bank traces and asset transfers. Expect updates within 72 hours. 72 hours. That was all he needed. He remembered something his father once told him when he was a boy fixing a broken clock. When a machine stops working, don't yell at it. Take it apart piece by piece. Find what's jammed, fix it, and put it back together better than before. That's what this was, taking apart the broken thing called his family. 2 days later, he received the first report. It was clinical, detached, and beautiful in its precision. The forensic accountant had followed the path of the stolen money like a trail of breadcrumbs: cash, withdrawals, short-term deposits, transfers to an account in Clara's maiden name. From there, payments to luxury stores, car dealers, and a down payment on a house in Scottsdale. All traceable, all provable. Robert read the report twice, every line etching itself into his memory. Then he called Calvin. "I want eyes on that property," he said. "Inside and out." Calvin's laugh was low, almost approving. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Robert smiled faintly. "Enjoyment isn't the word. Satisfaction, maybe." For the first time in weeks, he slept soundly. The following morning he drove downtown to the courthouse. The clerk at the records office barely looked up when he asked for property ownership details. She printed them out, handed them over, and said, "Anything else, sir?" "Yes," Robert said. "I'd like copies of all tax records associated with this address." When he walked out into the sun, he had what he needed. The foundation of a quiet, devastating truth. The property Daniel and Clara had bought wasn't fully theirs. They'd stretched themselves thin gambling that the stolen money would carry them through until the next payday. But it wouldn't. Robert would see to that personally. He spent the rest of the week preparing, documenting, and cataloging every piece of evidence. Each photograph, each receipt was a weapon. He arranged them meticulously in a binder labeled only with the word legacy. Daniel and Clara, meanwhile, continued their performance dinners with friends, new clothes, laughter that rang hollow through the house. Robert played along. He asked about their weekend plans, complimented their car, even offered to help them move when the new house was ready. They took the bait too self-assured to notice the tightening noose. One evening, Clara mentioned the upcoming closing date. "We'll be signing the papers next week," she said brightly. "It's all happening so fast." Robert raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said. His tone was warm, but his eyes were ice. Later that night he met Calvin in a dimly lit parking lot near the courthouse. Calvin handed him an envelope. Inside were photographs: Daniel shaking hands with a realtor, Clara standing in front of a sold sign, smiling. "They really think they've won," Calvin said. Robert folded the photos carefully. "Let them think that a little longer." He returned home to find Daniel sitting in the living room watching TV. "You're up late," Robert said. "Couldn't sleep," Daniel replied without looking away from the screen. "You worry too much, Dad. Things have a way of working out." Robert studied him for a long moment, the faint reflection of the television flickering across his son's face. "They do," he said quietly. "Just not always the way we expect." Over the next several days, the reports kept coming in: more bank trails, hidden accounts, digital receipts. Robert compiled everything into a single document and placed it in a fireproof folder, locking it in a new safe hidden behind a false panel in his study. This one had no shared code. No one but him would ever open it. He wasn't done yet. One afternoon, while Daniel was out, Robert contacted an attorney he trusted, Margaret Hale, a sharp, unflinching woman who'd once handled his estate planning. "Margaret," he said, "I need to update my will. Urgently. And I need a clause added, something specific about misuse of family assets." When she heard the situation, she whistled low. "Robert, are you sure you want to go down this road? It'll burn bridges you can't rebuild." "They set the fire," he said. "I'm just holding the match." The next morning, Margaret arrived with the documents. They sat together at the kitchen table, the same one where Helen used to serve Sunday breakfasts. Robert signed without hesitation. That evening, Daniel came home talking about a housewarming party. Clara was already sending invitations. Robert listened from his chair by the window, the faint sound of laughter cutting through the quiet. He thought about Helen, about the life they'd built, and the son they'd raised. Somewhere along the way, something had gone rotten in Daniel's heart, but Robert no longer cared to understand it. He walked to the window and looked out at the Audi parked in the driveway, gleaming under the porch light. Its reflection shimmered on the wet pavement like a mirage. He could almost see his own face in it, a man who'd been underestimated one too many times. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. The pieces were all in place now. The investigation, the accountant, the lawyer, the paper trail. Every thread led back to them, tied neatly into a knot they couldn't untangle. Robert turned off the light and walked upstairs, his steps slow but steady. He paused at Helen's photograph in the hallway, his fingers brushing the frame. "Almost done," he murmured. In the quiet of his room, he sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the faint sound of rain against the windows. The world outside slept, unaware that justice was already awake. And as he closed his eyes, he saw it all clearly: the Audi, the new house, the laughter, the arrogance. All of it temporary. Because the thing about the truth is, it always collects its debt. and Robert Miller was ready to send the bill. The sun hung low when Robert drove past the house Daniel and Clara had bought with his stolen money. The stucco walls were still unpainted, the lawn a patchy mix of dirt and weeds, but the sold sign was gone. They were home, finally convinced they'd built something lasting. Robert parked down the street far enough not to be noticed. The faint laughter from the open windows drifted out into the quiet evening light, and careless the sound of people who believed the world still belonged to them. He sat in the car for a long time, watching, memorizing every detail, the way Daniel gestured with his hands, the way Clara leaned back in her chair, wine glass tilted smug and radiant. It was the sound of thieves celebrating their perfect crime. But Robert knew something they didn't. He'd been to the county assessor's office earlier that week. What he'd found in the records had made his pulse steady and his breath slow the way it used to before a deal closed. The house Daniel was so proud of was already slipping through his fingers. They hadn't paid their property taxes. The amount wasn't much, not to Robert anyway, but enough to make the property vulnerable to a lien sale. He'd smiled when the clerk confirmed it. Anyone can purchase the lien, he'd asked casually. Anyone, she'd replied, tapping her long red nails against the counter. First come, first served. That was all he needed. He spent the next few days setting up a small limited liability company under a neutral name, Westbridge Holdings. A simple shell that traced back to no one but a P.O. box and a signature. His lawyer Margaret helped with the paperwork, asking no questions beyond what was necessary. She looked at him once, curiosity flickering behind her glasses. "You're being very thorough," she said. Robert smiled faintly. "Good accounting is just another form of storytelling." The transaction took less than an hour. A transfer, a few signatures, a notary stamp. The clerk slid the documents back across the counter. "Congratulations," she said. "You now hold the tax lien for parcel 178B. The words were simple, bureaucratic, but to Robert they sounded like a verdict. He drove home in silence, the papers resting on the passenger seat. Outside, the desert wind swept over the road, scattering dust in slow spirals. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. The world, it seemed, had a sense of timing. That night, he placed the official envelope in his study drawer beside the file labeled Legacy. The drawer clicked shut, and with it the weight he'd carried for weeks began to ease. For the first time since the theft, he felt something that wasn't grief or anger. It was satisfaction. Cold, clean, absolute. A few days later, Daniel stopped by the house, unannounced, his tone all charm and false warmth. "Hey, Dad," he said, stepping inside like he still owned the place. "Just checking on you. Haven't seen you around lately." Robert looked up from the newspaper, forcing a polite smile. "I've been keeping busy. Paperwork mostly." Daniel laughed. "Paperwork? Your retirement must really be getting to you." Robert folded the paper neatly, laying it aside. "Oh, you'd be surprised how productive I can be when I set my mind to something." Daniel missed the warning. He always did. "Well, I just wanted to let you know we're hosting a housewarming party next weekend. You should come. Bring that old bottle of whiskey Mom kept locked up. Might finally give us a reason to open it." Robert studied his son's face, the smirk, the glint of entitlement in his eyes, and thought of how easily greed dressed itself in confidence. "I'll think about it," he said. Daniel clapped him on the shoulder, leaving the faint scent of expensive cologne behind. "You do that." When he left, the house fell quiet again. Robert stared at the closed door for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "You just invited me," he murmured, "to the scene of your undoing." The following week passed in silence, the kind that builds pressure instead of peace. Every morning Robert checked his mail for the official certificate confirming his lien purchase. When it arrived, he ran his fingers over the embossed seal, admiring the beauty of legal authority. One piece of paper, and the house Daniel thought he owned now legally belonged to him if Daniel missed one more payment. The clock had started ticking. That weekend he attended the housewarming party. He arrived early, wearing a gray suit that hadn't seen daylight in years. The Audi was parked out front, freshly waxed, gleaming under the sun. Guests milled around, drinks in hand, admiring the new kitchen, the marble countertops, the view from the backyard. Robert moved among them like a ghost, polite, quiet, observing. At one point, Clara raised a glass and announced, "To new beginnings." Robert's lips curved slightly. "To paying what's owed," he murmured. No one heard him over the laughter. Daniel showed him around the property, pride swelling in every gesture. "Can you believe this? Finally ours." Robert paused at the window overlooking the desert, the horizon glowing orange in the dying light. "Funny thing about ownership," he said. "It's never really final until the paperwork clears." Daniel chuckled, not understanding. "Yeah, well, we're all paid up." Robert met his eyes steady and unflinching. "I'm sure you are." He left before dessert, the echo of their laughter fading behind him as he stepped into the night. The air was cool, electric, the kind of air that hums before a storm breaks. Over the next few weeks, letters began arriving at Daniel's house, warning statements, notices. Robert knew the tone of bureaucracy well. It started politely, then grew firmer, then cold. He didn't have to send a single word himself. The law would speak for him. By the end of the month, Daniel's mortgage company contacted him. Taxes were unpaid and the lien had been sold. He owed penalties, interest, fines. Clara's panicked call came that evening, her voice shaking. "Dad, have you heard anything about this? Some company bought our lien." Robert's voice was calm. "That happens when people forget their responsibilities." "What are we supposed to do?" she demanded. He let the question hang for a moment, the silence stretching. Then he said softly, "Maybe call your accountant. I'm sure he'll have a suggestion." He hung up before she could respond. That night he stood by his window again, looking out at the dark street. The faint sound of wind brushed against the glass. On his desk, the tax certificate gleamed faintly under the lamp. He picked it up, tracing the edge with his thumb. Every number, every clause, every paragraph was a quiet form of vengeance, legal, clean, undeniable. He poured himself a drink and lifted it slightly as if to toast someone unseen. "Here's to justice," he said. "May it always come dressed in paperwork." The next day Daniel called again, his voice tight, desperate, the first crack in his polished facade. Robert didn't answer. He simply smiled and set the phone face down. Outside, the desert wind carried the first chill of winter, and Robert knew the storm he'd set in motion had only just begun. It started with a letter, thick, cream-colored, stamped with a federal seal. Daniel found it in the mailbox one afternoon and tore it open right there by the curb. At first he thought it was junk mail, another notice about the mortgage or some tax reminder he could push off. But the words hit harder with every line. Internal Revenue Service. Request for documentation. Audit notice. Unreported income. The world tilted a little. He stood there in the driveway, sun glaring off the Audi's hood, reading the same paragraph 3 times before the meaning sank in. Inside the house, Clara was arranging flowers for a dinner party they couldn't afford. When he handed her the letter, her face drained of color. "What is this supposed to mean?" she asked, scanning the text, her manicured fingers trembling slightly. "They can't just accuse us of—" "They can," Daniel said. His voice cracked despite himself. "They already have." That night, the house that had once felt like a trophy began to shrink around them. Every ticking clock, every shadow felt like a reminder of something closing in. Robert knew it too. He could feel the shift from miles away, the first tremor before the collapse. He'd seen the signs before. When a man tries to build a life on stolen money, there's always a point where the numbers stop adding up. He didn't have to lift a finger. The system did what it always does. Somewhere in a government office, a computer flagged a deposit that didn't match reported income. One digital thread tugged at another, and the web began to unravel. A week later, Daniel came to visit, unshaven eyes, red-rimmed, wearing the same shirt as yesterday. The Audi was gone. He parked an old borrowed pickup in the driveway. Robert answered the door slowly, taking in the sight like a painting he'd seen coming together brushstroke by brushstroke. "Dad," Daniel said, forcing a weak smile. "Can we talk?" Robert gestured toward the living room. "We can always talk." Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees. "It's about the IRS. They're saying I didn't report some income from last year. Some deposits. I don't know how they even found them. Robert leaned back in his chair. They tend to find things. It's their job. Daniel rubbed his temples. I hired a lawyer. He's saying there might be penalties, maybe a fine. How much? Daniel hesitated. Depends on what they prove. Could be 50, 60,000, maybe more if they dig. Robert nodded slowly, letting the silence fill the room. That's a lot of digging. Daniel's voice wavered. Dad, I might need some help just for a while, until things clear up. There it was, the same plea wrapped in desperation instead of arrogance. Robert almost pitied him. Almost. You still have the house, Robert said quietly. Sell the Audi. It's gone, Daniel admitted. Repossessed last week. Clara maxed out the cards to pay the lawyer. Robert folded his hands. Actions have consequences, son. You used to know that. Daniel's composure cracked. You think I don't know? Everything's falling apart? The IRS froze our account, the mortgage company's threatening foreclosure, and Clara's. He stopped himself, realizing how much he'd already revealed. Robert didn't press. He didn't need to. The pieces were moving exactly as he'd planned. He watched his son crumble beneath the weight of debts and documents, not rage or revenge, but quiet, suffocating inevitability. A few days later, another letter arrived at Daniel's house, this time from the IRS attorney's office. The language was colder, the tone less polite. They wanted full documentation for large cash deposits linked to the property purchase. The lawyer's fees doubled overnight. Clara began selling off her jewelry, the same pieces Robert had recognized from Helen's collection. Karma had a way of returning what it borrowed. Meanwhile, Robert moved through his days with the same deliberate rhythm, morning coffee newspaper, pruning Helen's roses. He read about tax fraud cases and the penalties that followed. It wasn't joy he felt. It was equilibrium. For every lie Daniel had told, there was now a line of printed truth filed and stamped by the government itself. Clara called him one evening, her voice brittle. They're saying we could lose everything. Daniel's been up all night talking to accountants. They keep asking where the money came from. He told them it was inheritance. I told him to say it was from you. Robert's tone was steady. That would be a mistake. Why, you're his father. They'd believe it. Because I already filed my taxes, Clara. And they're clean. She went silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke again, the edge in her voice was gone. He's breaking Robert. You should talk to him before he does something stupid. Robert looked at the clock on the wall, the ticking as calm as his heartbeat. Sometimes the only way people learn is when the breaking's already done. By the end of the month, Daniel's lawyer withdrew from the case after unpaid bills piled up. The IRS placed a lien on his bank accounts. The mortgage company followed with foreclosure notices. Clara stopped answering calls altogether. When the final warning came, a certified letter requiring immediate payment, Daniel sat in the dark kitchen surrounded by unopened envelopes, his hands shaking. The house, once filled with light and laughter, now smelled of stale air and panic. Robert received a copy of the foreclosure filing through Westbridge Holdings. He opened it over breakfast the way other men read the morning headlines. The document was elegant in its simplicity, each line another brick removed from Daniel's crumbling fortress. That afternoon he drove past the property again. The windows were dark. A for sale foreclosure. Pending notice was taped to the door. He parked for a moment, watching a single curtain flutter in the hot wind. Somewhere inside he imagined Daniel sitting alone, head in his hands, the echo of his own arrogance still haunting the walls. Robert stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under his shoes. He looked at the house, the product of betrayal now reduced to debt, and felt the faintest trace of something close to peace. Not joy, not triumph. Just balance restored. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed with a new voicemail. Daniel's voice hollow and shaking. Dad, please. I don't know what to do anymore. They're taking everything. Robert listened to the message twice, then deleted it. He slid the phone into his pocket and looked out at the horizon where the desert sun was sinking behind the mountains. The light caught on the edges of his car window, turning the glass gold. He whispered almost to himself, "The law doesn't forget, son. It just waits its turn." The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, the kind of road that leaves men alone with their choices. And Robert, steady and unflinching, drove into the falling light, ready for what came next. The knock came just after sunset. 3 dull thuds, each one slower than the last, as if the man on the other side of the door had run out of strength or hope. Robert didn't move right away. He sat in his armchair, the glow from the fireplace flickering across the open folder on the table. Inside lay everything that had brought them to this point. Bank statements, property records, photographs, court filings. The paper trail of betrayal. He'd read them so many times that he didn't need to anymore. The truth was memorized. The evidence lived in his bones. When the knocking came again, softer this time, he finally rose. His footsteps were deliberate, slow, the way a man walks when he already knows what waits for him. He opened the door to find Daniel standing there, soaked from the rain. Eyes, hollow hair, matted to his forehead. The once polished man was gone. His clothes hung loose, his watch missing, his shoes caked in mud. He looked like someone who'd been living on borrowed time and had just discovered the debt was due. "Dad," Daniel said, his voice breaking on the word. "Please, I need your help." Robert said nothing. He stepped aside, letting him in. The house smelled of wood smoke and whiskey, warm and calm, in contrast to the chaos Daniel dragged in with him. Water dripped onto the floor as he stood there, clutching his jacket like a child. They froze, everything, Daniel said, pacing. The bank accounts, the car, even the house. The IRS, the lawyers, they're all circling. "Clara's gone. She left last week." Robert poured a drink, setting the glass on the table without offering it. "Didn't take her long." Daniel's eyes flashed. "Don't do that. Don't talk like you don't care." "I care," Robert said quietly. "I just learned to care differently." Daniel swallowed hard, his face twisted with a mix of shame and disbelief. "I made mistakes. I know that. But you have to understand, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just wanted to start over. I thought I could fix things." Robert turned toward him slowly, his gaze steady, unreadable. "You thought you could fix things by stealing from the man who built your life, from your mother's savings, from everything your family stood for. That's not a mistake, Daniel. That's a choice." Daniel's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry. I'll make it right. I just need a little time." Robert's eyes flicked toward the papers on the table, the ledger of Daniel's lies. "Time is what you took from me. From her. And it's the one thing I can't give back." The room went still. The rain outside tapped against the windows like a clock counting down. Daniel finally sat, head in his hands. "They're taking the house, Dad. The one I bought. They say it's owned by some company. I don't even know who." He stopped, his voice catching as realization crept in. He looked up slowly. "It's you, isn't it?" Robert didn't answer. He didn't have to. Daniel stood, his voice cracking. "You bought my house. You let me drown, and you bought it." Robert took a sip from his glass, the movement calm, almost graceful. "I didn't let you drown, son. I just stopped pretending the water wasn't rising." Daniel's hands trembled. "You could have told me. You could have helped me." "I did," Robert said. "When I raised you, when I taught you the difference between right and wrong, when I gave you a roof, a life, and a name you've spent the last year dragging through the mud, you had your help. You just chose greed instead of gratitude." Daniel's breathing quickened. He took a step closer, desperation twisting his face. "I can't lose everything. Please, Dad, just talk to them. You've got connections, money, something. I'll do whatever it takes." Robert's voice dropped to a near whisper. "You already did whatever it took." For a long moment the only sound was the fire crackling. Then Robert set his glass down and looked directly at his son, his tone calm, almost tender. "You stole my life's work, Daniel. I'm just collecting what you owe." The words landed heavier than any shout. Daniel blinked as if struck, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. The weight of it, the finality, settled between them like smoke. He stumbled back a step, then another, shaking his head. "You can't mean that. You're my father," Robert said softly. "Until you stop being my son." Daniel's face crumpled. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Watching me fall apart?" Robert's expression didn't change. "There's nothing enjoyable about justice. It's just necessary." Daniel's anger flared sharp and brief. "You think this makes you better than me? You're just as cold. Just as cruel." Robert leaned forward, his voice a low, steady current. "No. I'm just finished being naive." The rain outside intensified, hammering against the glass. Daniel turned away, running a hand through his hair, his breath ragged. He looked around the room, the framed photographs, the tidy shelves, the quiet dignity of a man who'd already moved on. "So that's it. You destroy me and call it even?" Robert stood, his posture calm, his voice firm. "No, Daniel. I didn't destroy you. You built this collapse with your own hands. I just made sure it didn't take me down with you." Daniel looked at him one last time, tears glistening in his eyes. "I have nothing left." Robert nodded once. "Then maybe you'll finally start earning something real." Daniel turned toward the door, hesitated, then looked back. "You're going to die alone. You know that." Robert's gaze was steady. Better alone with peace than surrounded by liars. The door opened. The rain poured in, soaking Daniel's jacket as he stepped into the storm. He didn't look back. The sound of his footsteps faded into the distance until only the rain remained. Robert stood there for a moment, the air heavy with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. Then he walked back to the table, picked up the folder, and slid it into the drawer, labeled "Closed." He poured himself another drink, the amber liquid catching the firelight. Outside, lightning flashed briefly, illuminating the wet road where Daniel's figure had vanished. Robert raised the glass, his reflection rippling in the window pane. "Justice," he murmured, almost to Helen, almost to himself. "It's never cruel, just late." He took a slow sip and stared into the storm where the faint rumble of thunder sounded like a verdict finally delivered. And deep down beneath the calm, something colder stirred an awareness that this wasn't the end. It was the pause before the next reckoning. Months had passed since that night, the night Daniel disappeared into the rain, leaving nothing behind but echoes and debt. The house had gone quiet again, not the uneasy quiet that used to sit between lies, but something deeper, cleaner. The kind of silence that comes after a storm when everything broken has already been washed away. Robert stood on the back patio, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. The sun was sinking low, bleeding gold across the horizon, painting the sky in soft orange and bruised purple. He'd forgotten how beautiful silence could be. The world for once wasn't demanding anything from him. No signatures, no confrontations, no more deceit pretending to be love. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees, slow and steady, like the breathing of a man who had finally earned his rest. The papers were all filed now, the liens cleared, the debts collected, the investigations closed. Daniel's name was gone from every record Robert cared to check. Westbridge Holdings, the shell company he'd built from patience and precision, now owned the house outright. Not as an act of revenge anymore, but as a reminder, a monument to lessons learned too late. He walked across the patio, his cane tapping lightly against the stone. Inside, everything was exactly as it had been before: Helen's piano by the window, the framed photo from their last trip to Monterey, the clock that still ticked a little slower than it should. He'd thought about replacing it once, but decided against it. Some imperfections, he realized, deserved to stay. They reminded you what time really cost. In the corner of the living room, an unopened envelope sat on the table. Daniel's handwriting. It had arrived weeks ago, no return address, just his name. Robert hadn't opened it. He didn't need to. Whatever it said, it couldn't change what had already been written in action. Some debts are too old for apology to settle. He left it there like a gravestone made of paper. The neighbors waved when he took morning walks now. He'd become something of a quiet legend in town, the old man who outsmarted everyone who turned betrayal into balance sheets. People liked to whisper about it, though none of them knew the whole story. And Robert never corrected them. Let them think it was about the money. Let them think it was cleverness. The truth was simpler and heavier. It was about dignity. About taking back what you refused to let the world strip away. As the sun lowered further, he settled into his chair, the same spot where he and Helen used to sit with coffee, watching the evening stretch out over the hills. He could almost hear her voice, soft, amused, calling him stubborn. "You always did take the long way to forgiveness," she'd say. He smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the only way that lasts." He'd kept the garden alive. The roses she planted bloomed again that spring, though some came out paler than before. Age had that effect on things, color fading, roots deepening beauty, changing form, but never leaving completely. He bent down once to cut a single rose, its petals catching the last shimmer of sunlight, and placed it gently on her old piano. The gesture wasn't grand, but it was honest. It said everything he couldn't put into words. In the distance, the faint rumble of thunder rolled again, a reminder that peace is never permanent, only borrowed. Robert didn't mind. He'd made peace with the idea that storms would come again in one form or another. What mattered was that he knew how to stand through them now. The phone buzzed on the table beside him, a message from Margaret, his lawyer. The final audit of Westbridge Holdings had cleared. The last tie to Daniel's chaos was officially gone. He typed a simple reply. "Thank you. Close the file." When he set the phone down, the world was quiet again. The light had turned soft and amber, the kind that made everything look forgiven. He took a slow breath, the kind that fills a man's chest with peace instead of pride. For the first time in a long time, he felt something close to freedom. Not the loud kind, the kind men shout about in bars or chase with fast cars, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes when you face the worst of people and didn't become like them. The kind that costs you everything you thought mattered and gives you back what actually does. He looked toward the horizon where the sun was slipping behind the ridge, its last light stretching long and low across the valley. Helen had loved sunsets like this. "They make endings look like beginnings," she used to say. He lifted his glass, the bourbon catching that last glint of gold. "Here's to endings, then," he murmured, "and to the fools who think they can escape them." He took a sip and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth burn slow. When he opened them again, the world had dimmed into that blue hush that comes just before night fully takes over. The crickets had started their song. Somewhere down the hill a dog barked once and went quiet. He stayed there until the last trace of light was gone, the house behind him glowing faintly in the dark. Tomorrow would come like it always did, slow, patient, relentless. He'd wake early, make coffee, and water the garden. Maybe he'd open Daniel's letter. Maybe he wouldn't. Some stories didn't need words to finish them. For now, the only thing that mattered was this: he had kept his name, his peace, and the quiet kind of power that comes from walking through fire and emerging without smoke on your hands. He leaned back, watching the stars appear one by one. The night felt infinite, almost forgiving. If anyone had been watching from the road below, they would have seen only an old man on a patio, a glass in his hand, the last glow of sunset fading behind him. But what they couldn't see, what only Robert knew, was that this wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of something purer. Because justice once done doesn't fade. It settles. It stays. And as the darkness took the sky, Robert smiled, calm, unburdened, unafraid. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, hit subscribe and share your thoughts below. Remember, real revenge isn't anger, it's wisdom, served cold. Life has a way of revealing truths we try too long to ignore. Robert's story reminds us that trust once broken teaches lessons that money never could. As we grow older, we learn that protecting our peace is far more valuable than protecting our wealth. Kindness should never make us blind, and forgiveness should never mean surrendering our dignity. The people we love may disappoint us, but that doesn't mean we lose ourselves in their mistakes. Standing up for what's right isn't revenge, it's self-respect. And sometimes walking away with your head high is the most powerful answer life allows. If this story spoke to your heart, share your thoughts below and hit subscribe. Your voice matters because wisdom deserves to be heard, and justice should never grow quiet.